Welcome to the dark past. Step into the shadows of history, where secrets, scandals, and forbidden stories come alive. In the comments below, tell us which city are you watching from and what time is it where you are right now. Let's see where our viewers around the world are tuning in from as we uncover the darkest corners of the past. Before dawn had fully broken, before the mist lifted from the low fields and the first wagon wheels creaked toward the main road, the realization spread like fire through dry timber. The two girls were gone. They had slept in the smaller quarters near the edge of the property, close enough to the tree line that wind sometimes carried the scent of pine through the cracks in the boards. By morning, their blankets were folded neatly. The space they had occupied held no sign of panic, no overturned stool, no hurried scramble. Just absence clean and deliberate. At first, the overseer assumed they had slipped out early for water. Then he noticed the bucket still hanging on its peg. He checked the cookhouse, the yard, the storage shed. With each empty glance, the air tightened. By sunrise, riders were dispatched in every direction. The plantation owner was not accustomed to being surprised. He built his reputation on control, on knowing how many hands worked his fields, how many bushels were harvested, how many lashes were required to maintain obedience. When he was told that the two sisters had vanished sometime during the night, he did not shout. He did not rage. He calculated. They were young, yes, but not helpless. He had seen the way they moved through the property. Quiet, observant. They fetched water without spilling. They remembered instructions without repetition. They spoke little in front of authority. It was easy to mistake that silence for submission. He had not made that mistake. Within hours, he ordered notices drafted. Not modest notices, not routine announcements. Bold lettering. Large numbers. A bounty that dwarfed previous rewards. The figure alone would ensure attention. It would transform the search from obligation into competition. Men who had never stepped foot on his property would saddle horses for a chance at the prize. Season trackers would weigh the risk and decide it was worth it. By noon, the number had been spoken in taverns 3 towns over. By evening, the county buzzed with anticipation. The impossible part was not that 2 enslaved girls had attempted escape. Such attempts, though dangerous, were not unheard of. The impossible part was that they had done so without triggering alarm. The perimeter had guards. The dogs had been kennelled but alert. The nearest road passed within sight of the main house. And yet no one could say precisely when the sisters had slipped beyond that boundary. Some claimed they must have fled after midnight. Others insisted they could not have moved far before dawn. No one considered that perhaps the timing itself was misdirection. As the first wave of bounty hunters arrived, some local, some from neighboring counties, the plantation transformed into a staging ground. Horses stamped impatiently in the yard. Rifles were inspected. Maps were spread across tables. Professional trackers crouched near the edge of the tree line, studying soil. They expected to find frantic footprints, broken branches, drag marks from hurried movement. Instead, they found confusion. There were impressions near the back fence, yes, but they overlapped with older tracks. The ground had been swept in places, not with obvious effort, but with careful brushing. A section of fence had been loosened days earlier and reattached so precisely that only close inspection revealed it. One tracker muttered that whoever did this had studied the land. Another suggested outside help. The owner dismissed that possibility. He preferred to believe he had been underestimated, not infiltrated. Still, as the hunters fanned out, something subtle began to unsettle them. The initial trail, faint as it was, led toward a shallow creek. There, the ground grew rocky. The water, slow-moving but wide enough to obscure scent, offered countless possibilities. Dogs were brought in. They circled, sniffed, whined. Then they hesitated. The scent trail fractured into nothing. One hunter insisted the girls must have crossed the water. Another argued they had doubled back. A third proposed they had split apart. That suggestion hung in the air longer than expected. 2 young siblings splitting in hostile territory seemed unlikely, dangerous. And yet, the absence of clear evidence forced speculation. As hours turned into a full day, more men joined the pursuit. The bounty figure traveled faster than the details of the escape. Soon, nearly 100 individuals, trackers, opportunists, militia volunteers moved through the region in widening circles. From a distance, it looked like dominance. But proximity revealed something else, fragmentation. Each group trusted its own assessment. Each tracker believed his interpretation superior. Some followed the creek north. Others veered east toward denser forest. A few insisted the girls would attempt the main road at night, blending into wagon traffic. Confidence clashed. Meanwhile, the sisters were already beyond the first perimeter of expectation. They had not run blindly into the woods. For months, quiet months, unnoticed by those who measured obedience by visible behavior they had observed. They had counted the seconds between guard rotations. They had watched which dogs barked at unfamiliar scents and which remained lazy. They had memorized where fence posts loosened during heavy rain. They had also studied the sky. On clear nights, when chores were finished and the air cooled, they looked upward. One sister traced patterns in the stars, repeating directions softly until they became internal compass points. The other listened to wind patterns, to distant train whistles, to the subtle hum of nighttime movement beyond the plantation as borders. Preparation does not always look like defiance. Sometimes it looks like patience. On the night they left, there had been no storm, no dramatic distraction, only routine. The guards expected stillness, the dogs were restless but contained. The moon hung thin, offering minimal illumination. They slipped through the loosened fence section with measured calm. They did not sprint. They walked at first, preserving energy, allowing distance to build before urgency dictated pace. By the time the first alarm stirred the property, they were already at the creek. There, they paused only long enough to remove shoes and wade carefully along submerged stones, stepping where current masked disturbance. They moved downstream for a stretch, then angled toward a fallen log that carried them across the rocky terrain. Every movement reduced trace. Back on the plantation, frustration mounted as daylight waned without results. The owner ordered lantern patrols through the night. Torches flickered along the tree line, casting exaggerated shadows that suggested presence where there was none. Some hunters claimed they heard movement beyond reach. Others insisted it was imagination. By the second day, fatigue began to gnaw at morale. 100 men covering fragmented ground do not operate as a single mind. They argue over direction. They guard pride. They resist admitting uncertainty. The bounty remained the only unifying force. Yet even that incentive began to warp perception. Every broken branch became potential evidence. Every distant sound sparked speculation. Groups doubled back on false leads, burning time and energy. Meanwhile, the sisters moved primarily at night, resting in elevated positions during daylight, wedged into natural alcoves between tree roots, concealed by dense undergrowth. They shared food sparingly, rationed water carefully. They did not speak much. Silence was safer. At one point, they heard riders pass within yards of their hiding place. Hooves thudded against soil. Voices argued about direction. The older sister placed a steadying hand over the younger, as mouth not to silence panic, but to steady breath. The riders moved on. Back at the plantation, tension thickened. The owner doubled the patrol radius. He sent riders to neighboring properties, urging collaboration. The notion that 2 young girls could elude such a large force bruised pride more deeply than any financial loss. But pride does not improve tracking. On the 3rd day, rain fell briefly, not a storm, but enough to soften soil and blur impressions. Hunters interpreted the moisture as setback. For the sisters, it was cover. They adjusted direction subtly, angling toward terrain less familiar to those pursuing them. Rocky ridges, narrow ravines, areas where sound traveled unpredictably. They were not merely escaping, they were navigating. As the search widened further, the number 100 began to feel less impressive. Men grew irritated at overlapping routes. Supplies ran thin, horses tired. Some hunters began to question whether the girls had already passed beyond the county line. Others whispered that perhaps they had assistance waiting somewhere ahead. The owner refused to entertain such doubts publicly, but privately he recalculated. A bounty of that size had been meant to guarantee swift capture. Instead, it had created spectacle. By the end of the week, the search no longer resembled a coordinated operation. It resembled scattered obsession, and still there was no capture. The sisters' absence grew heavier than their presence had ever been. In nearby towns, people began to track the hunt itself rather than the fugitives. They counted how many men returned empty-handed. They noted the tension in conversations. They watched as confidence thinned. The impossible escape was no longer just about distance traveled. It was about expectation defied. 2 young siblings had slipped through a net cast by nearly 100 hunters, not through brute strength, not through miracle, but through observation, timing, and unity. and as the days stretched into a second week without resolution, the number on the bounty notice began to feel less like a promise, and more like a question no one could answer. The first night beyond the plantation boundary did not feel triumphant. It felt unfinished. The sisters did not allow themselves the illusion of safety simply because the fence line had disappeared behind them. Distance was fragile. It could be erased in a matter of hours by men on horseback. What they had gained was not freedom, it was a head start. They moved until the sky softened from black to indigo. Only when the first faint ribbon of gray appeared along the horizon did they search for concealment. The older sister chose a thicket where briars tangled so densely that even small animals avoided forcing a path through. Inside, the ground dipped slightly, forming a natural hollow. It was not comfortable. It was not dry. But it was hidden. They crawled in without speaking. The younger sister, as breathing came fast at first, not from exhaustion but from the sudden quiet, the world beyond the plantation sounded different. There were no creaking boards, no distant shouts, only insects and wind and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures moving through brush. The older sister pressed a finger gently against her own lips, then pointed upward through the narrow opening where branches parted enough to reveal sky. The stars were fading, but the last one they had memorized still lingered faintly above the treetops. They had chosen their direction carefully, not directly north, as many would assume. That was predictable. Instead, they angled first west, following a line of low hills that shielded them from open fields. Only after reaching the creek had they adjusted. Planning had begun months earlier. The idea had first formed not during a dramatic incident, but during routine. The sisters had been sent to gather kindling near the far edge of the property. While collecting fallen branches, they noticed how the fence near that section leaned slightly inward, weakened by rot at the base. They said nothing. Days later, they returned to the same area. One of them dropped a small stone at the fence post, as base, loosening soil subtly. Again, no attention drawn. They began observing guard rotations more closely. There was a pattern, though it took weeks to confirm. After midnight, there was a lull 10 to 12 minutes when two patrol routes did not overlap. The dogs, too, had rhythms. Two of them barked at everything unfamiliar. One remained strangely passive, often lying down near the kennel gate. The sisters catalogued these details the way others might memorize a hymn. At night, lying on thin bedding, they whispered softly about timing. If they moved too early, they risked encountering the last patrol sweep. Too late, and the first morning watch would catch them before they reached the creek. They did not speak of what would happen if they were caught. That possibility did not need voice. The night they chose felt ordinary. No storm, no unusual distraction. Routine was their shield. They slipped out during that narrow gap between patrols, moving with the same measured pace they used when carrying water buckets to avoid sloshing. Speed attracts attention. Calm can slip unnoticed. At the fence, the older sister eased the loosened post aside, while the younger held it steady to prevent creaking. They slid through the gap one at a time, and carefully reset the wood behind them. From there, they did not run. They walked until the tree line swallowed them. Back in the present, as the first full day of hiding stretched long and tense inside the briar hollow, they could faintly hear distant movement. Riders, dogs. The search had begun. The younger sister, S' hand trembled slightly when a dog, S' bark echoed through the trees. The older sister leaned close and whispered, "They expect fear. We give them patience." They had anticipated the dogs. That was why the creek mattered. Water was not just an obstacle, it was strategy. When the sun climbed higher and heat thickened, insects swarmed inside the thicket. They did not swat at them. Movement, even small, could disturb leaves unnaturally. They endured. By late afternoon, the sounds of pursuit shifted farther away. Either the search parties had moved beyond their hiding place, or they had misread direction entirely. When dusk finally returned, bringing cooler air and deeper shadows, the sisters crawled out carefully, stretching stiff limbs. They drank sparingly from a small cloth pouch soaked earlier at the creek and began moving again. They angled toward a rocky rise they had glimpsed at dawn. Rocky ground was their ally. Soil preserves story. Stone keeps secrets. As they climbed the ridge, they paused often not from fatigue but to listen. Listening was survival. The forest communicated constantly. Sudden silence among birds often meant large movement nearby. Rhythmic cracking branches suggested deer. Irregular breaks could mean men. Twice, they froze completely as distant voices drifted through the trees. Once, They heard a man curse sharply, complaining about a false lead. The sound faded as quickly as it had appeared. By the second night, the search had multiplied. Nearly 100 bounty hunters, militia volunteers, and trackers fanned outward in widening arcs. Their confidence was still high. The bounty's size justified persistence, but numbers create noise. Groups overlapped. Orders contradicted. Some men followed instinct. Others deferred to professional trackers who disagreed among themselves. At the creek, confusion deepened. Dogs lost scent where the sisters had moved downstream along submerged stones. One tracker insisted the fugitives must have crossed east. Another argued they had doubled back west. A heated exchange followed. Meanwhile, the sisters rested high above that very creek, hidden in the fork of an old sycamore tree whose branches split low enough to climb without leaving obvious marks. From that vantage point, they watched lanterns flicker below like distant stars fallen to earth. The younger sister whispered they were closer than before. The older replied, "Close does mean right." That distinction mattered. On the third night, clouds gathered thick and low. Not a violent storm, just enough moisture in the air to blur scent and soften ground. The sisters adjusted their route again, descending the ridge on the far side where hunters were least concentrated. They crossed a patch of open land just before dawn, timing their movement to coincide with the heaviest fog. The field terrified them more than the forest had. Open space meant visibility. Exposure. They did not run across it. They moved steadily, heads low, using shallow depressions in the land as cover. Behind them, search parties argued over new fragments of trail discovered near the original creek crossing. Some hunters believed the girls had panicked and circled back. Others claimed they were still pushing north. The truth lay somewhere between directions, not linear, not predictable. As days passed without capture, fatigue seeped into the search effort. Supplies dwindled. Horses needed rest. Men who had arrived eager began calculating lost time and diminishing odds. The plantation owner, however, pushed harder. He sent additional riders to block main roads. He pressured neighboring landowners to tighten watch. But control does not stretch infinitely. On the fourth day beyond the escape, the sisters reached a narrow ravine that cut through the landscape like a scar. The descent was steep but manageable. At the bottom, water trickled faintly over stone. They paused there longer than usual. The younger sister asked quietly, "Do you think they are still behind us?" The older considered before answering. They were behind what they believe. It was not arrogance. It was assessment. They understood that hunters rely on pattern, on expectation, on assumptions about desperation. The sisters were not moving as desperation dictated. They were moving as preparation allowed. That difference created distance. Late that night, as they rested beneath an overhang within the ravine, distant thunder rolled. Rain began in earnest, this time steady, soaking, relentless. The downpour transformed the landscape. Trails dissolved. Scent vanished. Small streams swelled into churning lines of water. Back in the forest above, hunters scrambled to protect supplies and find shelter. Some cursed the weather. Others welcomed it, believing fugitives would struggle more than trained men. But the sisters had anticipated storms as both risk and opportunity. They used the rainfall to cover their climb out of the ravine on the opposite side. Water masked sound. Mud concealed footprints beneath constant impact. By dawn, they had placed miles between themselves and the last confirmed search radius. Behind them, nearly 100 bounty hunters spread across terrain that no longer held coherent narrative. Their numbers felt less like strength and more like confusion. And ahead of the sisters lay uncertainty, yes, but also possibility. The impossible aspect of their escape was not speed. It was discipline. It was the refusal to act according to fear script. They were not the fastest. They were not the strongest. But they were aligned with each other, with the land, with timing. As the storm faded and pale light filtered through thinning clouds, the sisters stood atop a ridge neither had ever seen before. Beyond it stretched unfamiliar territory. They did not celebrate, they did not relax, they simply kept moving, because the bounty still existed, and somewhere behind them, 100 men still believed capture was inevitable. What those men did not yet understand was that inevitability had already fractured, and every step the sisters took into new terrain widened that fracture further. By the fifth morning, the hunt had stopped feeling like a pursuit and started feeling like a problem. Nearly 100 men had scattered across woods, ridges, creeks, and narrow roads, each convinced that somewhere just beyond the next rise, the two girls would appear exhausted and cornered. Instead, what they found were fragments, impressions without direction. signs without story. The first real argument broke out near a stretch of soft earth not far from the original creek crossing. The tracker knelt, running calloused fingers across faint indentations. They came through here, he insisted. Light steps, close together. Another man crouched beside him and shook his head. Too small, could be from last week. They were fresh. They were nothing. Behind them, others waited impatiently. Every hour lost chipped away at confidence. The bounty was large enough to justify obsession, but obsession without progress turned sour. The plantation owner had ridden out personally that morning, not to track, but to observe. He watched the men debate over nearly invisible impressions and felt irritation settle in his chest. He had paid for certainty, not speculation, but certainty was dissolving. What none of the hunters realized was that the sisters had passed through that very patch of earth hours earlier deliberately. They had stepped lightly, yes, close together, yes, but only for a short stretch. After 20 paces they had split in opposite directions. The idea had been discussed quietly 2 nights earlier while sheltering beneath the rocky overhang during the storm. If they follow both, the younger had whispered, they divide. If they follow one, the older replied, the other circles. It was risky. Separation in hostile terrain invited vulnerability, but remaining predictable invited capture. So at dawn, when the ground was soft enough to preserve imprint clearly, they had executed the plan. The older sister veered west, stepping deliberately enough to leave visible traces: broken twigs, displaced leaves, faint heel marks in mud. She moved quickly but not carelessly, making the trail believable. The younger angled east, choosing rocky patches where footprints faded almost immediately. She circled wide, keeping a mental map of the older sister as last direction. They had agreed on a meeting point near a cluster of 3 twisted oak trees visible from a ridge. Neither had allowed fear to surface during the separation. Back in the present, as hunters argued over the prints, one faction committed to the western trail. It looked clearer. It looked promising. Nearly 20 men moved in that direction, dogs straining at leashes. The eastern possibility was dismissed as weak, too inconsistent. Exactly as intended, the older sister, aware that she was being followed, adjusted her pace. She did not sprint. Sprinting invites urgency in pursuit. Instead, she moved steadily, allowing the hunters to feel they were gaining ground. Twice she doubled back briefly along her own trail, stepping carefully within earlier footprints before veering off at sharp angles through underbrush. Dogs barked in excitement as scent seemed to strengthen, then faltered when it fractured unexpectedly. Meanwhile, the younger sister reached the oak cluster first. She climbed halfway up one of the trees and waited, counting heartbeats, listening for distant signs of conflict. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, the older sister emerged from the southern edge of the ridge, breath-controlled, eyes scanning. They did not embrace. They nodded, reunited. Behind them, the western search party had followed the decoy trail deep into thicker forest, only to find it dissolve near a rocky bluff. Frustration erupted. They split. Word spread through the scattered groups. The girls were not running blindly. That afternoon, the search effort reorganized. Hunters formed tighter clusters. Orders were barked more sharply. Pride stung by misdirection sharpened tempers. The plantation owner doubled down, sending additional riders to block southern crossings. He believed they must be trying to angle north again. He underestimated their flexibility. The sisters, after reuniting, adjusted direction southward, briefly counterintuitive, risky. But counterintuitive movement confuses expectation. They traveled primarily through elevated terrain where wind stripped scent quickly. They avoided valleys during daylight, knowing sound traveled farther there. That evening, as they paused near a narrow stream, they heard something new, organized horn blasts echoing from multiple directions. The hunters were coordinating signals. Nearly 100 men could not cover every inch of forest, but they could attempt containment. The older sister studied the fading light filtering through trees. They were tightening, she whispered. The younger nodded. Then we loosen. They descended into the stream itself and walked along the shallow water for nearly half a mile, stepping carefully to avoid slipping. When the water curved sharply, they exited onto a bed of flat stones and scattered dry leaves across the muddy bank behind them to obscure exit marks. It was exhausting work. Precision demands patience when fatigue begs for speed. By the 7th day, tension among the hunters had turned brittle. Some believed the girls had already slipped beyond reach and that continued pursuit wasted time. Others insisted the bounty demanded perseverance. Professional trackers felt their reputations challenged. How could two young siblings outmaneuver seasoned men? But the answer lay not in strength, it lay in unpredictability. On the 8th morning, a breakthrough seemed imminent. One group discovered scraps of cloth caught on a thorn bush, fresh, torn recently. Excitement surged. Riders were summoned. Dogs sniffed the fabric and howled eagerly. The plantation owner allowed himself a thin smile. They were close. What he did not know was that the cloth had been left intentionally. The younger sister had torn a small strip from the lining of her dress the previous night, knowing that as fabric thinned, she could spare a fragment. They placed it where it would catch attention, visible enough to spark pursuit, but positioned near terrain that complicated tracking. The trail from that cloth led toward a marshy stretch dotted with uneven ground and hidden pools of water. Hunters charged in confidently, only to find horses struggling and boots sinking. Movement slowed. Frustration mounted. And by the time they extricated themselves, the sisters had circled wide once more. The search had become reactive. The hunters chased signals rather than leading them. As the days stretched on, nearly 100 bounty hunters moved across miles of terrain, yet coordination deteriorated, supplies thinned, tempers flared. Accusations surfaced, claims that someone had misread tracks, that another had missed obvious signs. The girls, meanwhile, conserved energy by resting longer during daylight in elevated positions, tree forks, rocky shelves, dense thickets descending only when darkness thickened enough to swallow them whole. One night, distant gunshots echoed through the forest, warning shots fired by frustrated hunters hoping to flush movement. The younger sister flinched. The older remained steady. Noise is fear, she said quietly. That understanding guided them. They did not respond to noise. They responded to silence. By the 10th day, the bounty had taken on a different meaning among the hunters. It no longer symbolized easy wealth. It represented a challenge to ego. Men who had arrived boasting now avoided eye contact when discussing progress. Some slipped away quietly, claiming urgent matters at home. The number 100 began to shrink. Still, the search persisted. On the 11th night, as the sisters climbed another ridge under a sliver of moonlight, they glimpsed something faint in the distance, a lantern swinging in slow rhythm. Not a search party. The pattern was wrong, too deliberate, too isolated. They paused, watching carefully. The lantern dipped twice, then steadied, a signal. They did not approach immediately, caution over curiosity. But after observing for several minutes without change, they angled slowly toward it, staying within shadow. As they drew closer, a quiet voice called from beyond the light. Its edge, not loud enough to carry far. "We've been watching." The sisters froze. The voice continued, calm, measured. "You've stirred half the county." It was neither threat nor praise, just acknowledgement. The lantern holder remained partially concealed. An older figure, posture relaxed but alert. The older sister stepped forward cautiously. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows these woods better than those chasing you." The lantern dimmed slightly as it was shielded from wider view. Behind them, somewhere far off, horns sounded again, hunters coordinating another sweep. The figure with the lantern glanced in that direction. They were loud. The younger sister asked softly, "Will you turn us in?" A pause. "Then, if I meant to, you'd already be surrounded." Silence settled heavy between them. The impossible escape had entered a new phase. For nearly 2 weeks, two young siblings had outmaneuvered nearly 100 bounty hunters through patience, planning, and psychological inversion. Now, standing at the edge of deeper wilderness, they faced a different question, not whether they could evade pursuit, but whether they could trust beyond it. Behind them, the search force continued to fracture. Ahead lay uncertainty, but one truth had solidified beyond doubt. 100 men had not been enough. And with each day that passed, that number felt smaller, not because it had physically diminished, but because it had failed to define the outcome. The hunt had become proof of something far more unsettling to those who believed in control. That two determined minds, aligned and prepared, could dismantle inevitability piece by piece until even 100 hunters felt lost in their own pursuit. By the 12th day, exhaustion had begun to level the field. Not equally, but noticeably. Nearly 100 bounty hunters had entered the search with confidence sharpened by money and reputation. Now many moved with slower steps, shorter tempers, and quieter voices. Horses showed strain. Supplies ran thin. And worst of all for men accustomed to dominance, the forest no longer felt neutral. It felt hostile. The sisters, too, were exhausted, but their exhaustion carried purpose. They were not chasing. They were not reacting to orders barked from behind. Every step forward increased distance from chains. Fatigue, when tethered to meaning, weighs differently. The older sister had accepted the lantern holder's quiet offer of guidance cautiously, not surrendering control, only listening. He did not give them a name. He did not ask for theirs. "You've crossed into ground that does forgive noise," he said, leading them along a narrow ridge barely visible in the dark. That is why they are failing. Too many boots. He walked without lantern now, eyes adjusting to moonlight, steps precise and practiced. The younger sister asked, "Will they follow?" "They'll try," he replied. "But this land folds. Sound travels wrong. Trails end where they shouldn't." He gestured toward a valley below, thick with fog despite the hour. "Down there, men get turned around." The sisters exchanged a glance. They had already learned that lesson. Behind them, the hunters were reorganizing once more. Frustration had forced strategy change. Instead of scattered sweeps, they attempted containment, establishing perimeter points along main paths, narrowing assumed escape routes. But the assumption remained flawed. They believed the sisters were heading toward predictable destinations, roads north, river crossings, known routes used by previous fugitives. What they could not see was that the sisters were now being guided through terrain most of them avoided. By dawn, the three of them reached a steep incline covered in loose shale. The lantern holder paused. "You climb here," he said quietly. "Not straight up. Angle sideways. Less slide." The younger sister's legs trembled from fatigue, but she nodded. They climbed carefully, hands gripping rock, bodies leaning forward to distribute weight. Below, faint horn blasts echoed again. Closer. The hunters were tightening. Halfway up the incline, the older sister glanced back. Through breaks in foliage, she could see movement, small clusters of men advancing cautiously. Dogs strained at leashes, though their enthusiasm had dulled over days of inconsistent scent. "They were spreading again," she whispered. "They don't know how not to," the guide replied. At the top of the incline lay dense woodland thicker than anything they had yet crossed. Sunlight struggled to penetrate fully. The air felt cooler, damp. The guide stopped beneath a fallen tree trunk large enough to conceal three bodies easily. "You rest here," he said. "No fire, no talk above breath." "And you?" the younger asked. "I circle." He disappeared as quietly as he had appeared. For the first time since meeting him, the sisters were alone again, but with knowledge. They were no longer navigating blindly. They were moving within a larger pattern of terrain advantage. Below, the hunters reached the shale incline and hesitated. One man attempted to lead his horse upward, only to lose footing halfway and slide back amid curses. Others tried dismounting, but progress was slow and clumsy. "Why would they climb this?" someone demanded. "Because they think we won tea," another replied bitterly. That recognition stung. The search had shifted from confident pursuit to reluctant problem-solving. Nearly 100 hunters now felt the weight of terrain more than the promise of bounty. As the day wore on, heat thickened beneath the tree canopy. Insects swarmed. Tempers flared again among the searchers as they debated whether to press through the incline or circle around. Circling meant losing time. Climbing meant risking injury. The plantation owner, who had remained at the outer perimeter coordinating supply lines, received conflicting reports. Some groups insisted they were closing in. Others warned that the terrain favored the fugitives dangerously. He refused to concede ground. "Keep pressure," he ordered. "They cannot outrun numbers, but numbers require cohesion." And cohesion had been eroding since the creek crossing days earlier. High above, the sisters slept in shifts beneath the fallen trunk. The older remained awake first, listening. The forest carried sound unevenly. At times it seemed silent, at others faint echoes distorted distance. She thought of the plantation, the rhythm of forced routine, the predictability of orders. Out here, unpredictability was survival. When the younger sister awoke, she whispered, "Do you think they'll stop?" The older considered. "They don't know how," she said softly. "Stopping would mean admitting." "Admitting what?" Their two girls changed the story. Below, a group of hunters finally committed to climbing. Without horses, rifles slung over shoulders, they moved slowly upward, sweat-darkened shirts. Boots slipped. One man lost footing and scraped his arm against sharp stone, drawing blood. Frustration simmered. They reached the top hours later only to find no clear trail. The forest floor here was thick with old leaves and needles. Footprints vanished almost immediately. Wind patterns shifted scent unpredictably. Dogs whined uncertainly. The hunters spread out, but tight visibility reduced range. Communication faltered as voices failed to carry clearly. Somewhere beyond their sight, the lantern holder observed quietly, then moved in a wide arc to rejoin the sisters. "They're climbing," he reported in a whisper, "but they're blind." He studied the older sister carefully. "You've done well. But from here, speed matters less than direction." He traced a rough map in dirt with the stick lines representing ridges, valleys, and a distant river. "That river bends north but splits unexpectedly," he explained. "Many follow the main branch, few know the split." The younger sister leaned closer, memorizing. "We don't stay near it long," the guide continued. Water carries sound. Behind them, a hunter shouted faintly, having discovered a partial footprint pressed deeper into damp soil near a rotting log. Excitement rippled.
"They're right here."
Momentum surged briefly among the searchers, but they followed that faint trail. It ended abruptly at a cluster of exposed roots. Confusion returned. The sisters had intentionally left that mark just enough to confirm presence, not enough to guide. Psychological erosion works best when reinforced intermittently. As dusk approached, the guide led them toward the river split he had described. The path narrowed through tight undergrowth. Movement required careful bending and stepping over twisted vines. The younger sister stumbled once, catching herself against a tree trunk. The older steadied her. "You tired?" she whispered. "We both are," the younger replied, attempting a smile. Behind them, horns sounded again, less coordinated than before. Groups had lost synchronization. Some hunters began withdrawing quietly, calculating diminishing returns. Word spread that several men had abandoned pursuit entirely. Nearly 100 had begun. Far fewer now remained committed. Night fell heavy by the time they reached the river. Moonlight reflected faintly off moving water. The bend appeared ordinary at first glance, but as they followed the bank carefully, a smaller branch peeled away behind a curtain of overhanging branches. "Must miss it," the guide said softly. They waded through the shallows of the smaller branch, stepping carefully to avoid splashing. After a short distance, they climbed onto a gravel bank concealed by dense growth. The guide stopped. "From here," he said, "you move alone." The younger sister, eyes widened slightly. "You want come?" He shook his head. "My place is here, yours is beyond." The older sister met his gaze. "Why help us?" He looked toward the dark forest where distant voices still echoed faintly. "Because I've watched too many hunts," he replied quietly, "and this one deserves to fail." He stepped back into shadow, disappearing without farewell. The sisters stood alone once more. Behind them, the hunters had finally reached the main river branch and assumed it was the primary crossing. Several groups followed it north, confident they were narrowing the gap. None noticed the hidden split. By midnight, rain began again, light but steady. It washed away what little evidence remained near the smaller branch. As the sisters moved onward, the landscape shifted subtly. Terrain grew less familiar to those who had begun the hunt. Patrol patterns thinned. Roads lay farther apart. For the first time since crossing the plantation fence, a fragile sense of possibility expanded within them, not safety, but widening margin. Behind them, nearly 100 bounty hunters had been reduced by fatigue, confusion, terrain, and pride. What had started as overwhelming force now felt fractured and distant. The search continued, yes, but its momentum had been broken. And as the sisters disappeared deeper into land that folded and concealed with quiet indifference, one truth settled heavily over the forest. The impossible was no longer hypothetical. It was unfolding step by deliberate step, beyond the reach of 100 men who had believed capture was inevitable. The storm arrived without warning, rolling over the low hills like a dark tide swallowing the sky. By late afternoon, the air had grown heavy and metallic, thick with the scent of rain and charged with the kind of silence that makes birds vanish from treetops. For the hunters, it was an inconvenience. For the two sisters hiding miles ahead of them, it was an opportunity. They had been moving carefully for days, measuring every step against the risk of leaving behind a trace. They knew the bounty had grown larger with each passing sunrise. They knew the number of men hunting that had multiplied, spreading outward like spokes on a wheel. And they understood something even more important. The men searching for them relied on predictability. They relied on trails, on patterns, on footprints pressed into soil. A storm erased all of that. The first thunderclap echoed through the forest like a cannon shot. The younger sister flinched, instinctively reaching for her older sibling's hand, but the older one did not panic. She tilted her head slightly, listening not to the thunder, but to the direction of the wind. It was shifting west. That meant the rain would sweep across the terrain they had already crossed before it reached the low valley where they were hiding. Their tracks would be gone long before the search parties doubled back.
When the rain came, it came in sheets.
The forest floor transformed within minutes. Dust became mud. Leaves flattened under the weight of water. Small creeks swelled into rushing currents. The sisters moved quickly but deliberately, stepping into the rain rather than hiding from it. Soaked clothing was a small price for invisibility. Behind them, nearly 100 bounty hunters were scattered across miles of countryside. Some were professionals, men who had made careers of tracking the desperate. Others were volunteers drawn by money, pride, or the thrill of the chase. When the sky opened, their frustration was immediate. Horses reared, dogs howled, tents collapsed under wind, and worst of all, the scent trails began to dissolve. A seasoned tracker knelt in the mud where he had found faint impressions earlier that morning. He pressed his fingers to the ground, watching water fill the shallow depressions. Within seconds, they disappeared entirely. He swore under his breath. The storm was not just washing away tracks, it was scrambling their entire operation. Communication between search groups would falter. Landmarks would blur. Streams that had been shallow crossings at dawn would be impassable by dusk. For the sisters, the storm was a living ally. They angled toward the open stretch of land they had been avoiding for days, a broad meadow that would have exposed them instantly under clear skies. In dry weather, crossing it would have been suicide. But in a downpour thick enough to blur sight beyond a few yards, it became their only chance to put real distance between themselves and the tightening search grid. They waited until the rain grew heaviest. Water ran in rivulets down their faces. Thunder masked the sound of their footsteps. The younger sister hesitated at the tree line, staring across the gray blur of the field. The older sister squeezed her hand, once a silent signal, and stepped forward. The meadow felt endless. Grass whipped sideways under wind gusts. Lightning flashed in jagged streaks, illuminating the world in split-second snapshots. The bent fence posts at the far end, the dark line of trees beyond, the shape of distant riders struggling to control their mounts on high ground. The sisters moved low, keeping their bodies angled against the wind, never running in a straight line for more than a few seconds. Even in chaos, the older one refused to surrender strategy. Halfway across, the ground dipped unexpectedly into a shallow basin that had begun to flood. Water pooled ankle-deep, then calf-deep. The younger sister stumbled, but her older sibling steadied her before panic could take hold. They adjusted course, skirting the deepest section while staying within the curtain of rain. At the meadow's edge, they slipped into the trees just as a distant shout pierced the storm. Someone had seen movement. The cry was faint, distorted by wind, but unmistakable. A rider had glimpsed two shapes crossing the field, yet the rain worked in their favor once more. By the time the alarm reached other searchers, visibility had shrunk to nearly nothing. Horses balked at the flooded ground. Gunpowder grew unreliable in damp conditions. Dogs struggled to differentiate scent from the overwhelming smell of soaked earth. The sisters did not stop moving. Inside the forest, the storm intensified. Branches snapped under the weight of water. Fallen leaves formed slick carpets that could betray careless footing. But the rain also masked sound so completely that the world felt isolated, sealed off from pursuit. The older sister led them toward a narrow ravine she had memorized from whispered descriptions passed between enslaved workers long before the escape. The ravine was dangerous even in dry weather, a steep descent, with loose rock and uneven footing. In a storm, it was treacherous. Water now rushed through its base like a newborn stream, but that was exactly why she had chosen it. They climbed down carefully, using exposed roots for support. Mud coated their hands. More than once, small stones slid underfoot, threatening to send them tumbling. Yet the roar of water below promised something invaluable: erasure. When they reached the bottom, the stream was swift but shallow enough to cross. They did not simply step over it. They waded into it and began walking within it, moving upstream against the current. Cold water numbed their legs. The younger sister gasped at the shock, but she understood the logic. Walking in the stream would eliminate any clear exit point for trackers. If the hunters found the ravine, they would see only water flowing in both directions. They would have to guess which way the girls had gone. The sisters traveled in the current for nearly a mile, enduring the chill, ignoring the ache in their muscles. Finally, at a bend where the stream curved sharply around a cluster of boulders, they climbed out onto a flat rock face that rain had scrubbed clean. There, they paused, not to rest fully, but to listen. The storm, as intensity began to fade into steady rainfall, thunder grew distant, the forest exhaled. In that quieter aftermath, the faintest sounds became meaningful, a branch snapping far away, the distant bark of a frustrated dog, the creak of saddle leather carried by wind. The hunters were still searching, but they were disoriented. Across the countryside, search parties attempted to regroup. Some argued that the girls had perished in the storm, swept away or lost. Others insisted they had used the chaos deliberately. Accusations flew. Orders contradicted one another. A few hunters abandoned the effort altogether, unwilling to risk injury in flooded terrain. The professional trackers, however, grew uneasy. This was no longer a simple pursuit. The girls had crossed open land during the worst weather, used a ravine few outsiders would know about, and vanished into running water. It suggested planning. It suggested patience. It suggested guidance, perhaps from people who knew these lands intimately. Night fell slowly, heavy clouds refusing to part. The sisters pressed onward, climbing higher into rocky terrain where soil thinned and footprints would be harder to detect even after the storm passed. Hunger gnawed at them, but adrenaline kept their steps steady. They knew they had gained something priceless that afternoon. Time. Time meant confusion among the hunters. Time meant exhaustion would settle into their bones. Time meant doubt would grow. By the second day after the storm, search efforts began to contract rather than expand. Horses had gone lame in mud. Supplies were waterlogged. Morale dipped. Some bounty hunters insisted the girls must have circled back in the chaos. Others believed they had pushed farther than expected. No one could agree. Meanwhile, the sisters found temporary shelter in a hollow beneath an overhang of stone, high enough to avoid pooling water. They shared the last of their hidden provisions and allowed themselves their first real rest since the storm began. The younger sister, hands trembled not from fear, but from the release of tension. The older one stayed awake longer, listening for any sign of approach. None came. When the sun finally broke through days later, it illuminated a transformed landscape. Trails were gone. Campsites abandoned. The storm had not merely hidden the sisters, it had dismantled the hunters. Advantage. Word spread among the bounty parties that the trail had gone cold. One by one, men began to leave. Some claimed they would return when conditions improved. Others muttered that no reward was worth chasing ghosts through flooded forests. A few remained stubborn, but even they could not deny the truth. The storm had shattered their momentum. For the sisters, the storm became something more than weather. It became a turning point. Before it, they had been running, constantly calculating how to stay just ahead of pursuit. After it, they felt the balance shift. The hunters were no longer certain. The numbers that once felt overwhelming, 100 armed men against 2 young girls, suddenly seemed less powerful when stripped of coordination and clarity. The storm had proven something vital. Nature did not favor ownership or authority. It did not respect bounties. It did not respond to money or threats. It moved freely, and in its freedom, it had shielded them. As they resumed their journey northward, moving carefully through rocky uplands where tracks would scatter easily, they carried with them not just survival but confidence. They had crossed open land in plain sight and lived. They had erased their trail beneath pounding rain. They had walked inside a river and vanished. And somewhere behind them, nearly 100 men were left staring at washed-away footprints, wondering how 2 sisters could slip through their grasp like water through open hands. The storm did not simply change the search. It changed the story. From that moment forward, the hunt was no longer a display of power. It was a lesson in humility. The landscape itself had chosen no side, but it had reminded everyone involved that force and numbers meant nothing without understanding. The sisters understood. And in that understanding, they found a path that no bounty hunter could follow. By the time the 6th night settled over the forest, the number of men still searching had thinned, but the danger had sharpened. The loudest, most reckless bounty hunters had withdrawn after the storm unraveled their momentum. What remained were the patient ones, the quiet ones. The men who believed fear was a tool sharper than any blade. The sisters felt the change before they saw it. For days after the storm, they had moved with cautious confidence. The land had been scrubbed clean, the tracks erased, the hunters scattered. But now the woods felt different, too still, too watchful. The birds took flight without obvious cause. Small animals darted in sudden bursts from underbrush that had been silent seconds before. Someone was near. The older sister slowed her pace, lifting her hand slightly, a signal they had agreed upon long before the escape. The younger stopped instantly. They listened. Wind moved through pine needles in a soft hiss. Somewhere distant, water trickled over stone, and beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, came the crunch of a boot stepping on dry bark. Not close enough to see, close enough to follow. The older sister did not panic. Panic was loud, panic left evident. Instead, she did something unexpected. She altered their rhythm. Rather than speeding up, she slowed them further, as though unaware of pursuit. She allowed the follower to gain confidence. Behind them, a bounty hunter crouched low, satisfied with what he believed was a careful shadowing. He had abandoned the large search parties 2 days earlier, convinced that numbers were a liability. One man could move quietly. One man could think clearly. He had picked up faint disturbances near a rocky ridge that others dismissed. He trusted his instincts. He did not realize he was being studied in return. The sisters angled toward a stretch of forest thick with fallen timber. The storm had knocked several trees loose, creating a tangled maze of trunks and splintered branches. It was difficult terrain, dangerous terrain, perfect terrain. The younger sister felt her pulse quicken as they approached the obstacle. She trusted her older sibling's judgment completely, but the tension in the air felt like a tightening rope. Still, she followed without hesitation. They entered the tangle slowly. Branches scraped against their sleeves. Mud sucked at their boots. Progress became deliberate, almost sluggish. Anyone trailing them would assume exhaustion had finally taken hold. Behind them, the hunter smirked. He interpreted the slowed pace as weakness. He believed the terrain favored him, that the sisters would make a mistake under pressure. He advanced carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. The older sister had anticipated that. Halfway through the fallen timber, she paused beside a partially uprooted tree whose roots arched upward like a frozen wave. She knelt briefly, adjusting something invisible to casual eyes. Then she continued forward, guiding her sister along a narrow, stable path they had mapped in whispers during earlier scouting. The trap was simple, not a snare meant to maim, not a weapon meant to kill. It was a misstep waiting to happen. When the hunter reached the uprooted tree, he chose what appeared to be the most direct route, stepping over a slick trunk at an angle that seemed solid. The bark shifted beneath his weight. His foot plunged into a concealed pocket of soft earth beneath tangled roots. He fell hard, rifle clattering from his grasp, shoulder striking splintered wood. Pain exploded through his arm. The sound echoed farther than he intended. The sisters did not run. They moved steadily forward, knowing that sudden speed would only draw attention. The hunter cursed under his breath, scrambling to recover, humiliated more than injured. He retrieved his weapon and pressed on, but now his movements carried frustration. That frustration was exactly what the older sister wanted. Over the next mile, they repeated the pattern in subtler ways. A loose stone positioned at the crest of a slope. A misleading scuff marked, pointing toward denser brush, while their true path angled elsewhere. A patch of disturbed leaves placed deliberately to suggest haste. Each detail eroded the hunter's confidence. By nightfall, he had lost visual contact entirely. The sisters climbed to higher ground and waited in silence beneath a canopy of thick branches. No fire, no conversation, only listening. In the darkness below, the hunter searched in widening circles. He found scuffed leaves leading nowhere. He found a broken branch that suggested someone had slipped. He found, to his mounting irritation, no consistent direction. For the first time since beginning the pursuit alone, doubt crept in. Were they doubling back behind him? Were they watching from somewhere unseen? The storm had already disrupted the search once. Now the forest itself seemed to conspire against clarity. The next morning, the sisters executed a different strategy. Instead of avoiding signs of their presence, they created them. They left faint footprints in a patch of soft ground clear enough to be noticed, spaced as though fatigue had shortened their stride. They allowed a piece of cloth to snag visibly on a thorn bush. They disturbed water at the edge of a shallow creek without entering it. It was bait. The hunter found the signs within hours. Relief washed over him. The chase felt tangible again. He quickened his pace, convinced he was closing in on weary prey. He did not see the shift in direction 50 yards ahead. The sisters had circled wide around a rocky outcrop, climbing silently over stone where no prints could remain. From that vantage point, they watched him pass below, following the false trail deeper into thick undergrowth. The younger sister, as breathing was shallow with intensity. She had never imagined they would one day watch a hunter searching for them from above. The power dynamic felt surreal, fragile but real. The older sister did not celebrate. She studied him instead. He moved with skill, scanning ground carefully, adjusting when signs grew faint. He was not reckless like others. He would not give up easily. That meant fear, not fatigue, would be their tool. That evening, as twilight blurred the forest into shadow, they positioned themselves near a narrow passage between two boulders, a natural choke point along the false trail. They remained hidden as the hunter approached cautiously, senses heightened. Just as he stepped between the stones, a sudden noise erupted behind him, a rock dislodged intentionally from higher ground. It clattered loudly down the slope, followed by the unmistakable snap of a branch. The hunter spun, rifle raised. Nothing, only darkness thickening between trees. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He pivoted slowly, scanning every direction. The forest answered with silence. Minutes stretched. Sweat chilled along his spine. He began to walk backward, unwilling to turn his back fully on unseen movement. Another sound came from a different direction, a rustle too deliberate to be whined. He fired a warning shot into the dark. The echo ricocheted through the woods, startling birds into frantic flight. When silence returned, it felt heavier. The sisters had already withdrawn, moving quietly upslope beyond his sight. They had no intention of engaging. Their objective was uncertainty. That night, the hunter did not sleep. Every crack of a twig jolted him upright. Every distant hoot of an owl felt like a signal. He realized, slowly and with growing unease, that the sisters might know he was alone, that they might be guiding him rather than fleeing him. By morning, his movements had changed, less confident, more reactive. He began checking behind himself more often than ahead. The sisters sensed the shift. They reduced their visible signs entirely now, allowing the forest to swallow them again. Without fresh clues, the hunter, as anxiety deepened, he retraced steps. He second-guessed earlier conclusions. He wasted energy searching areas he had already cleared. 2 days later, he encountered another search party converging from the east. They asked what direction he had tracked the girls. His answer was vague. He could not explain it clearly. He had been certain once. Now he was not sure whether he had followed them at all, or simply followed illusions they placed in his path. The sisters, meanwhile, had gained miles. They moved through terrain increasingly rocky and uneven, where soil gave way to stone and wind erased minor disturbances. The psychological shift was complete. The hunters were no longer coordinated pursuers. They were isolated men, questioning their own senses. And somewhere among them, stories began to circulate. Stories that the girls could vanish into rivers, that they could climb slopes without leaving prints, that they could appear behind you without sound. Exaggerations, perhaps, but powerful ones. Fear does not require truth. It requires imagination. The older sister understood this instinctively. Every false trail, every time noise, every calculated delay had one purpose: to expand the hunters. Imagination beyond reason. Because once a hunter begins to imagine danger everywhere, he cannot focus on what is real. On the 10th night since the storm, the sisters reached a ridge overlooking distant hills rumored to mark the edge of a safer territory. The journey was not over, but the terrain now favored them almost entirely. Behind them, search efforts fractured further. The lone hunter who had followed them longest finally turned back, not defeated by exhaustion but by uncertainty. He could not say with confidence that he had ever truly been on their trail. He could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes had watched his every step, and that feeling lingered. The sisters did not know the exact moment he withdrew. They did not need to. They only knew the forest had grown quiet again, not with tension but with release. They had never fought with force. They had never confronted directly. They had turned terrain, timing, and perception into shields. In doing so, they had achieved something extraordinary. They had not just escaped pursuit. They had reversed it. And in the dark heart of a forest once filled with 100 determined bounty hunters, fear had changed direction. By the time the 7th phase of the pursuit began, the number of hunters had shrunk to a hardened few men too stubborn, too proud, or too desperate for the reward to abandon the chase. They were no longer spread across miles of forest in chaotic waves. Now they moved with grim precision, tightening their search into a narrowing corridor that pointed toward a rugged gorge locals rarely entered. The sisters felt the shift long before they saw signs of it. For days, the forest had been quiet in a way that suggested withdrawal. The constant, distant echoes of shouted orders, barking dogs, and cracking branches had faded, but silence can mean many things. It can signal safety or concentration. The older sister sensed concentration. She noticed subtle patterns, distant bird flocks lifting suddenly and settling again in a line rather than random bursts. A faint wisp of smoke one evening that vanished quickly as if deliberately concealed. Once, at dawn, she found a boot print on rocky soil where prints should not have held, a man placing his weight carefully, testing ground instead of marching across it. They were being narrowed. The younger sister saw the tension in her sibling, as eyes but did not ask questions. Their communication had evolved beyond words. A glance, a hand movement, a pause in stride, each carried meaning. Ahead of them lay the gorge. It was a jagged scar carved through the landscape, its walls rising sharply on either side of a narrow, winding path at the bottom. In dry months, it was merely difficult terrain. After the storm weeks earlier, runoff still trickled through parts of it, leaving sections slick and treacherous. Few locals used it unless necessary. But the older sister had chosen it deliberately. A gorge can trap you, or it can shield you. It depends on who understands it better. Behind them, 5 men converged from separate directions, guided by fragments of information gathered over days. They had compared notes, studied, discarded clues, realized the sisters were angling northward with remarkable consistency. One among them, a tall, weathered tracker with a scar across his jaw, believed he had anticipated their route. They'll have to cross the gorge, he told the others quietly. There is no clean way around it without losing weeks. He was correct, but he underestimated something crucial. The sisters did not need a clean path. They reached the rim of the gorge at twilight. Wind swept upward from below, carrying the smell of wet stone and moss. The younger sister peered down and felt her stomach tighten. The descent was steep, uneven, unforgiving. The older sister studied the opposite wall instead. She wasn't searching for the obvious trail at the bottom. She was searching for something less visible, a narrow ledge halfway down that followed the gorge's curve like a hidden balcony. They had heard about it months before from a field hand who once trapped small animals in the area. It once demarked on any map. It once stable enough for wagons or horses. But for 2 careful climbers, it offered something priceless: unpredictability. They began their descent before darkness fully settled. Loose stones shifted underfoot, dust crumbled from beneath their boots. Twice, the younger sister slipped and caught herself on jagged outcroppings. The older one moved slightly ahead, testing each hold before signaling it was safe. Below them, the main path at the gorge's base appeared invitingly direct. It was the route any hunter would expect them to take. It was also the route that could be watched from both ends. When they reached the narrow ledge, barely wide enough for one person at a time, the younger sister exhaled in disbelief. From above, it was nearly invisible. From below, it blended into the rock face entirely. They turned sideways and began moving along it slowly, backs brushing stone, toes finding cautious purchase. Above them, unseen in the dimming light, the 5 hunters reached the rim of the gorge from separate angles. The scarred tracker knelt near the edge and examined faint scuffs in the dirt. He followed them toward what seemed to be the most logical descent point, the main trail. They went down, he said quietly. He was not wrong, but he was not entirely right. The hunters split into 2 groups, one descending immediately, the other circling to block the gorge's northern exit. They believed they were closing a trap. As night deepened, the gorge amplified every sound. A pebble dislodged above echoed like a drumbeat. A cough carried farther than expected. The sisters paused frequently, listening. Halfway along the ledge, the older sister heard it, a faint metallic click from below. A rifle being adjusted. She pressed herself flat against the rock, signaling stillness. At the gorge's bottom, one of the hunters had reached the narrow path and paused to scan upward. He sensed something. Not movement exactly, but absence. The kind of quiet that suggests presence. He stepped forward slowly, boots splashing in shallow runoff. The sisters remained motionless, barely breathing. The hunter's lantern cast flickering light against the stone walls, but its angle could not reach the thin ledge above him. After several long seconds, he continued walking. Only when the light had passed entirely did the sisters move again. Above, the second group of hunters completed their circle to the northern exit. They positioned themselves strategically, confident the sisters would eventually emerge along the main path. Time passed. An hour. 2. No sign. The hunters at the bottom advanced cautiously through the gorge, lanterns raised, rifles ready. They found occasional loose stones, a faint slide mark here or there enough to confirm descent. But at a sharp bend, The trail seemed to thin strangely. The scarred tracker crouched low, frowning. He studied the ground with intense focus. The runoff water obscured most prints, but he sensed something was missing. There should have been more disturbance, more evidence of hurried movement. He stood slowly, scanning the gorge walls, and for a fraction of a second, he glimpsed what he thought might be a shadow shifting along the rock face. He raised his lantern higher. Nothing. Only uneven stone catching light. He hesitated. The sisters, now nearly at the gorge's northern bend, had reached the most dangerous section of the ledge. Here it narrowed to mere inches before widening again. Below, one misstep would send them tumbling directly into the hunters' path. The younger sister swallowed hard. The wind had picked up, tugging at her clothing. The older sister crossed first, carefully placing her feet sideways, fingers digging into tiny cracks in the stone. When she reached the wider section beyond, she turned and extended her hand. The younger followed. Halfway across, a small stone broke free beneath her heel and dropped. It struck the gorge floor with a sharp clack. Instantly, lantern light swung upward. "Up there!" one hunter shouted. Rifles were raised, but the angle was steep and uncertain. The sisters flattened themselves against the rock as a shot cracked through the night, ricocheting off stone in a burst of sparks. Fragments scattered, but the narrow ledge shielded most of the impact. The older sister did not freeze. She pulled her sibling the final few inches across and continued forward without hesitation. Below, the hunters scrambled, attempting to reposition for a clearer angle, but the gorge walls distorted sound and perspective. By the time they reached a point directly beneath the ledge's continuation, the sisters had already rounded the bend and vanished from sight. The scarred tracker felt frustration surge. They had been within reach. He barked orders to move quickly toward the northern exit. If the girls reached it first, the advantage would shift again. But the sisters had anticipated that. At the end of the ledge, rather than descending directly to the gorge floor, they climbed upward along a secondary crack in the rock face, a steep, hidden ascent that led not to the obvious exit, but to a ridge overlooking it. By the time the hunters reached the northern mouth of the gorge, rifles ready, they found it empty. No movement, no footprints leading out, only silence. Confusion flickered across their faces. "They can still be inside," one muttered. But inside was exactly where the hunters remained, while the sisters now stood above them on the ridge, hidden by darkness and elevation. From that vantage point, they watched the men below argue in hushed tones. The trap had inverted. The hunters had expected prey to run forward. Instead, the sisters had stepped sideways into space few considered possible. After a tense hour, the men split again, some returning through the gorge, others scanning surrounding hills. Their coordination, once tight, began to fracture under doubt. The scarred tracker lingered longest, staring into the darkness as if willing the landscape to reveal secrets. But even he could not conjure a trail where none remained. Eventually he turned back. The sisters waited until the last lantern glow disappeared before moving north along the ridge. The confrontation had not been loud, it had not been prolonged, yet it marked a decisive moment. They had not merely escaped a narrowing net. They had passed through it. By dawn, the gorge lay quiet once more. The hunters regrouped miles away, forced to confront a possibility they had resisted, that two young sisters had outmaneuvered them not through strength, but through insight. For the sisters, the ridge opened into rolling terrain, rumored to border communities where bounty hunters tread carefully. The air felt lighter, the horizon wider. They were not yet safe, but the balance had tipped permanently. The final narrowing had failed. And in its failure, the legend of two shadows moving where 100 men could not began to take shape not as myth, but as consequence, because the gorge had tested both sides equally, and it had revealed which ones truly understood the land beneath their feet. By the time the eighth and final stretch of their journey began, the landscape itself seemed to breathe differently. The trees thinned into wider groves. The ground rose and fell in softer hills instead of sharp ridges. The air carried the faint scent of distant settlements, not the kind marked by plantations and patrols, but quieter communities tucked along trade routes and northern paths. The sisters had traveled for weeks under constant pressure, but now the tension shifted into something stranger, uncertainty about what came next. Behind them, the last determined hunters had fractured into smaller efforts. Some refused to admit defeat. Others quietly withdrew, unwilling to spend more time chasing figures who seemed to dissolve into terrain itself. The bounty still existed, ink on paper. Money promised that its urgency had cooled. Stories of the gorge confrontation circulated among the remaining searchers, and every retelling grew slightly more dramatic. They vanished off the cliff. They climbed stone like ghosts. They were watching us the whole time. Fear exaggerates what it cannot control. The sisters did not know the exact shape of those stories, but they sensed the change. For the first time since the escape began, they moved without the constant sound of pursuit echoing in the distance. No dogs. No shouted commands. No gunshots ricocheting through trees. Silence returned, not the tense silence of hiding, but the fragile quiet of possibility. Still, the older sister refused to relax fully. She had learned that safety often disguises itself as comfort too early. Instead of following the most direct northern route, she guided them along a series of indirect paths that avoided obvious crossings and settlements. She trusted no road that looked convenient. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in muted gold, they reached a high overlook. Below stretched a patchwork of fields divided by fences and dotted with small farmhouses. Smoke curled gently from chimneys. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying. Civilization meant witnesses. Witnesses could mean betrayal or salvation. The younger sister studied the scene with wide eyes. After weeks of forest, rock and river, the open farmland looked exposed beyond measure. There would be no trees to hide behind, no ravines to slip into. Every step across that landscape would be visible from a distance. The older sister weighed options carefully. To the west lay more forest dense, but leading into territory rumored to be patrolled heavily. To the east stretched open roadways where travelers passed frequently. North, through the farmland, lay a rumored network of sympathetic communities who quietly assisted those fleeing bondage. Rumors were dangerous, but so was hesitation. They descended the overlook under cover of night. Crossing farmland required a different kind of strategy. There were no natural traps to set, no ledges to disappear along. Instead, they moved between shadowed fence lines, keeping low and pausing whenever a dog barked in the distance. Twice they lay flat in tall grass as lantern light passed along distant porches. At one farmhouse, the older sister noticed something unusual. A small lantern hung low near a barn, shielded partially by cloth so that its glow was visible only from certain angles. She froze. It was not random placement. It was deliberate. She had heard whispers long ago of signals, subtle indicators placed by those willing to help, visible only to eyes trained to search for them. She did not approach immediately. Instead, they circled wide, observing the farmhouse from a concealed ditch for nearly an hour. They watched the rhythm of the house. A man emerged briefly to check livestock, then returned inside. No patrols, no armed guards scanning fields. The younger sister whispered for the first time in days, her voice barely audible, "Do we trust it?" The older sister did not answer immediately. Trust had nearly cost them everything before, but survival had also required measured risks. The bounty might still draw opportunists northward. Staying perpetually in the open would only extend danger. Finally she nodded. They approached slowly, staying within shadow. At the barn door, the older sister knocked twice, then once more after a pause. Not a code they had memorized, but a cautious rhythm meant to sound intentional. Footsteps approached inside. The door opened a few inches. An older woman peered out, her eyes sharp despite her age. For a long moment she said nothing. She studied the sisters, faces, their worn clothing, their posture balanced between fear and readiness. "You've come a long way," the woman said quietly. It was not a question. The older sister nodded once. The woman stepped aside without further words. Inside the barn, the scent of hay and livestock mixed with something else, safety. They were given water first, then food. Simple things that felt almost overwhelming after weeks of rationed scraps. The younger sister ate slowly, as if afraid the meal might vanish. The woman spoke little. She did not ask for details. She did not inquire about bounty amounts or pursuers. Instead, she explained that they could remain hidden for a night, perhaps two. After that, arrangements would be made. Arrangements. The word carried weight. By dawn, the sisters were concealed in a false compartment beneath stacked feed sacks. When distant riders passed along the road later that morning, they did not stir. The farmhouse appeared ordinary from every angle. News traveled through whispers. Within 2 days, a quiet network activated individuals who moved people discreetly from one safe location to another. The sisters were guided at night to a wagon headed north, concealed among goods bound for market. Each transition was swift, efficient, practiced. At one stop, a man handed them heavier cloaks and new shoes. At another, they were given new names, temporary ones, easier to answer if questioned. The older sister listened carefully to each instruction. She never surrendered full awareness. Even within help, she watched for signs of danger. But the danger did not materialize. Instead, the further north they traveled, the more the air itself seemed to change. Patrol frequency diminished. Conversations carried different tones. People looked at them not as property, not as targets, but as travelers. Weeks after the gorge confrontation, the sisters crossed an invisible boundary into territory where the bounty held less power. The moment itself was quiet. No banner marked the line. No trumpet sounded. They simply stepped off one stretch of road and onto another, guided by a man who nodded once and said, "You, past it now, past it." The younger sister stopped walking. The meaning settled slowly, past the reach of the hunters, past the authority of those who claimed ownership over their lives, past the grid that had narrowed around them for so long. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness, but from the sudden release of sustained vigilance. The older sister remained steady, though her own breathing shifted subtly. She had carried responsibility every mile. Only now did she allow herself to acknowledge what they had accomplished. 100 bounty hunters had mobilized. Dogs, rifles, trackers, storms, gorge traps, tightening corridors, and still, they stood free. In the weeks that followed, their story spread quietly through the same networks that had carried them north. It was told in barns, in back rooms, in coded letters. It traveled southward too, whispered in fields where others still labored under watchful eyes. The details varied. Some claimed they had crossed rivers underwater. Others insisted they could read terrain like maps etched into stone. A few embellished the gorge incident into something nearly supernatural. The sisters did not correct these stories. Legends serve purposes facts sometimes cannot. If their escape inspired courage in someone still waiting for opportunity, the exaggerations were harmless. Years later, the bounty would be remembered not for its size but for its failure. The plantation owner who once announced it with certainty faded into obscurity. The hunters returned to other pursuits. The storm became a distant memory in weather records, but the tale of two sisters who could not be caught endured, not because they were invisible, not because they possessed magic, but because they understood something fundamental. Pursuit depends on expectation. Break expectation and pursuit falters. They had refused to run predictably. They had stepped sideways when others assumed forward. They had turned terrain into ally and fear into shield. In the end, their victory was not loud.